The steel trap slipped from Lemuel Rusk's frozen fingers and clattered against the Rocky Creek bed. Dawn was breaking over the Wind River Valley in Wyoming Territory, and the November cold had already seeped through his elk-hide coat. He cursed under his breath, retrieved the trap from the icy water, and glanced nervously at the tree line 50 yards behind him. 5 nights in a row now. 5 nights the wolves had circled his camp, coming closer each time. Most trappers would have moved on. The other men in his brigade had urged him to abandon this promising beaver stream and rejoin the main party camped 15 miles south near Horse Creek. But Lemuel had found something the others hadn't seen, a pristine tributary where beaver dams stood untouched, where the pelts would be thick and valuable this late in the season. 2 more weeks here could finally clear his debt to the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. $120 stood between him and freedom. The wolves had different plans. Last night had been the worst. He'd woken to find 3 of them just beyond the reach of his campfire's light, their eyes reflecting amber in the darkness. His dogs, 2 mixed-breed curs he'd traded for at the last rendezvous, had gone wild, barking and snarling. But the wolves hadn't retreated. They'd simply sat there, watching, calculating. When Lemuel had fired his rifle into the air, they'd trotted away with the casual indifference of animals who'd learned that noise didn't mean death. They'd be back tonight and the night after. Lemuel wasn't afraid of wolves exactly. In his 4 years working the mountains since 1829, he'd encountered them dozens times. They were intelligent, cautious, remarkably adaptable. The problem was simple. A lone trapper meant potential food scraps, and with winter closing in, they were getting bolder. On the 5th night, he'd been forced to fire his rifle 3 times to drive them off. Each shot meant carefully measuring powder, pouring it down the muzzle, wrapping a lead ball in a patch, ramming it home, priming the pan. Each shot consumed precious resources. Each shot cost money he didn't have. And each shot taught the wolves that loud noises weren't actually dangerous if they just moved back 20 yards and waited. Standing in that freezing creek on the 6th morning, Lemuel made his decision. He would stay at this stream. He would trap out these beaver. And he would find a way to keep those wolves at a distance that didn't require burning through his ammunition or losing sleep to exhausted vigilance. He had no formal education. He could barely read beyond the level needed to understand a supply contract. But he had something more valuable: 4 years of observing how things worked in the wilderness. He'd watched beaver build dams without knowing the words engineering or hydraulics. He'd seen how Native Americans positioned their camps to take advantage of prevailing winds. He'd learned through trial and error which materials held up to mountain weather and which failed. Now he would apply that knowledge to a problem no one had adequately solved. How does a lone trapper defend his camp against persistent wolf packs using only the materials available in 1833 Wyoming Territory? Over the next 2 weeks, Lemuel would develop a series of inventions that his fellow trappers would initially dismiss as foolish, wasteful, and unnecessary. They would mock his contraptions, question his sanity, predict his failure. They would be wrong. The Rocky Mountain fur trade of the 1830s was brutally simple. Companies extended credit for equipment at prices 10 to 15 times what those goods cost in St. Louis. A 50-cent frying pan? $5 at a wilderness trading post. Coffee, gunpowder, steel traps, same markup. New trappers typically owed between $200 and $400 before they caught their first beaver. The only way out was through pelts, $4 to $6 each at the annual summer rendezvous. 8 to 12 beaver per day, if you were good, and the stream was rich. Lemuel Rusk had been caught in this system since 1829. 4 years of work had reduced his debt from $380 to $120. He was close, so close, to being a free trapper. That's why he'd stayed when the others left. That's why he was willing to risk camping alone 15 miles from help. That's why he needed to solve the wolf problem without abandoning his traps. The first 3 nights had been manageable, using standard procedure: large fire burning, dogs positioned near his sleeping robes, rifle loaded and within reach. But by the 4th night, something had changed. The wolves weren't respecting the fire anymore. They'd approach to within 30 feet and simply observe. When his dogs barked, the wolves would shift position but not retreat. They were learning. The first invention came from frustration and coffee. That morning, nursing his coffee as the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline, Lemuel noticed his tin cup sitting next to 3 others he'd accumulated over the years. Mountain men accumulated such things. Dead comrades' possessions got divided among survivors. Broken equipment got cannibalized for parts. He had 4 cups when he only needed 1. He also had 20 feet of spare rope cordage he'd braided from buffalo sinew during the previous winter. And he had an observation. The wolves approached from 3 consistent directions, following game trails that converged on his camping spot. They moved along paths of least resistance, just like water flowed around obstacles. By noon, Lemuel had constructed what he would later call his wolf bells. 3 spare tin cups suspended from cordage at waist height, strung between trees to create a perimeter covering the 3 main approach trails. The cups hung at irregular intervals, set low enough that a wolf moving along the trail would likely brush against them. The mechanics were simple. The cups were loosely attached using small loops. Any significant contact would cause them to swing and clang together, creating metallic noise that would alert him and, more importantly, startle the wolves. That night, around midnight, one of the cups clanged sharply. His dogs immediately began barking. Lemuel grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of his fire's light to see a lone wolf backing away from the rope line, head lowered, clearly startled. The wolf retreated 50 yards, sat down, watched for 20 minutes, then departed. One night's success proved nothing, but the principle seemed sound. Create unexpected obstacles that break the wolves' comfortable approach patterns. Over the next 2 days, Lemuel refined his system. He added a second line at a different height. He collected empty powder tins and suspended those alongside the cups. Different metals created different tones. He made the spacing irregular, predictable pattern a wolf might learn to avoid. But the cups and tins only created noise when touched. They were an alarm system, not a barrier. He needed both. The barrier idea came from watching his dogs and thinking about beaver. Every time Lemuel trapped a beaver, he harvested the scent glands, the castor that beaver used to mark territories. Applied to a stick near a trap set, it attracted other beaver who came to investigate the intruder. Trappers preserved these glands carefully because running out of bait could waste an entire season. Lemuel realized he could apply the same territorial principle to the wolf problem, just using different scents. Over previous weeks, he'd hunted elk, deer, and 2 bears. Mountain men wasted nothing from a kill. They ate meat, used hides for clothing, fashioned tools from bones, rendered fat into tallow. But certain parts, internal organs, bladders, intestines, had limited utility after initial processing. These parts carried strong scents, particularly from predators like bear. Lemuel began collecting and strategically placing these materials around his camp perimeter, just beyond his rope and cup alarm system. He wasn't creating a scent barrier that would repel wolves that wouldn't work. Wolves are attracted to dead animal smells. Instead, he was creating confusion. Elk intestine here, bear stomach there, deer bladder over there, all at nose height for a wolf. An approaching wolf would smell elk, then bear, then deer, all in close proximity. The logical conclusion: something's wrong here. Why are these mixed scent markers present? Is this a trap? Is there a larger predator claiming this territory? Wolves survive by being cautious. If a location smells confusing or potentially dangerous, they'll typically hunt elsewhere unless truly desperate. The scent markers also masked his own scent and food smells from camp beaver tail roasting, elk steaks rendering fat, coffee brewing. By surrounding his camp with stronger, more confusing scents, Lemuel created an olfactory screen. On the 8th night, 4 wolves approached. Lemuel heard his alarm system clang. The wolves paused, circled, then spent several minutes investigating his scent markers. Through darkness beyond his fire, he could see their silhouettes moving from one hanging material to another, sniffing, trying to make sense of the information. Eventually, they moved on. No threatening behavior, no close approach. They simply departed. But Lemuel wasn't satisfied. His systems worked against normal wolf behavior, but he knew truly hungry wolves would eventually push through any deterrent that didn't pose actual physical danger. Winter was approaching. Food would become scarce. The wolves would get bolder. He needed something more active, something that would create consequences without requiring him to wake up and fire his rifle every time. The third invention emerged from thinking about the 1833 rendezvous on the Green River. An older trapper named Gideon Marsh had told a story about a rabid wolf wandering into camp when the men were drunk. The wolf had bitten multiple trappers before someone killed it. The incident became legendary not because of the attack itself, but because of how exposed the trappers had been, sleeping in the open, too intoxicated to maintain watches or keep fires burning. The lesson: camps could be penetrated quickly when proper vigilance wasn't maintained. Lemuel identified 3 large dead branches positioned in trees near his main approach trails. Each weighed perhaps 30 to 40 pounds. He used rope to rig a simple trigger system. Rope ran from the branch down to a trip line positioned across the trail at about knee height for a wolf. The goal wasn't to hurt the wolves. A falling branch probably wouldn't cause serious injury. The goal was to create a startle response to condition wolves to associate approaching his camp with unexpected, potentially dangerous events. He spent an afternoon positioning these deadfall traps, making sure they were set back far enough that falling branches wouldn't hit him or his dogs. Testing was nerve-wracking. Using a long stick to trigger each trap from safe distance, the first branch crashed down exactly as planned. The second triggered properly but got hung up in vegetation. He adjusted. The third worked perfectly. Resetting took about 30 minutes each. Labor-intensive, but worth it if the traps created enough uncertainty. That night, the 9th night, everything came together. Around 10 o'clock, his cup and tin system alerted him. His dogs began barking. Through darkness, Lemuel heard the distinct crash of one of his deadfall traps releasing, followed by scrambling sounds of multiple wolves retreating quickly. No further approach came. Next morning, he found tracks showing where at least 4 wolves had circled his camp, but hadn't come closer than 40 yards, significant improvement from previous nights when they'd approached to within 20 or 30 feet. One deadfall trap had triggered. The trip line was broken, the branch lying across the game trail. The wolves had encountered it and scattered. No wolf injured, but definitely startled. But Lemuel's confidence nearly killed an innocent man 2 days later. He was checking his trap line around midday when he heard a massive crash from the direction of his camp, followed by a scream human, not animal. His blood went cold. He'd been so focused on wolves that he hadn't considered another possibility: other trappers passing through. Lemuel ran back to camp, rifle ready, heart pounding. What he found made his stomach drop. A young trapper couldn't have been more than 19 lay, sprawled on the ground beneath one of his deadfall traps. The branch had caught him across the shoulders and back. He was conscious, gasping, trying to push the heavy wood off himself. "Don't move!" Lemuel shouted, rushing over. "Let me get this off you." Together they managed to heave the branch aside. The young man sat up slowly, wincing. His name was Henry Caldwell, he said, part of a small brigade working streams to the east. He'd been following fresh elk tracks and hadn't seen the trip line until it was too late. "What in God's name is that?" Henry demanded, pointing at the deadfall mechanism still dangling from the tree. "You trying to kill somebody?" Lemuel felt genuine shame. In his focus on wolves, he'd created a hazard that could easily injure or kill another human. The branch had caught Henry off-center. If it had hit him squarely on the head or neck, it could have broken his spine. "Wolf deterrent," Lemuel explained. "Didn't think about other people coming through. I should have marked it better." Henry stood up carefully, testing his limbs. Nothing broken, miraculously, though he'd have bruises for weeks. He looked at the rope system, the trigger mechanism, the carefully positioned branch. Wolf deterrent? His tone shifted from anger to curiosity. Does it work? Lemuel explained his situation, the persistent pack, the need to stay at this location, the various systems he'd developed. Henry listened intently, occasionally touching his sore shoulder. "I'll be damned," Henry said finally. "We've got the same problem 15 miles east. Lost 2 dogs last week to a pack that keeps testing our camp. You say these things actually work?" "They're working so far, but I need to make them safer for people." They spent the next hour modifying Lemuel's deadfall traps. Henry suggested adding warning markers, strips of bright cloth tied to trees on either side of the trip lines, positioned at eye level where a person would see them even if they weren't looking down. It was a simple modification that Lemuel should have thought of himself. Henry also pointed out that the trap triggers were too sensitive. A wolf weighed 60 to 80 pounds. A man weighed significantly more. By adjusting the trigger tension, they could make it so the traps would only release under the weight of something larger than a wolf, meaning they'd still startle wolves that hit the trip line but wouldn't actually drop the branch unless something heavier came through. Of course, that means you can't use them on the main game trails, Henry observed. Elk will trigger them same as a man. "The wolves don't use the main game trails to approach camp," Lemuel said. "They use the smaller side trails where they can move quieter. I can adjust the trigger tension for those." Before Henry left to rejoin his brigade, he asked detailed questions about Lemuel's other systems. The scent markers particularly interested him. His brigade had tried various methods to deter wolves, shooting into the air, keeping multiple fires burning, even setting out poisoned meat. But nothing had worked consistently. The poisoned meat had actually made things worse by attracting more predators to the area. "Thing is," Henry said, "we can't afford to keep shooting at them. Powder and lead cost money, and we can't spend every night standing watch. Men get tired, they make mistakes, people get hurt." "That's exactly why I built these systems," Lemuel said. "They work while you sleep. That's the whole point." Henry looked at the various elements of Lemuel's camp, the cups hanging from ropes, the strange scent markers, the smoke fire setup that Lemuel had explained. It looked chaotic, almost comical. But Henry had just experienced firsthand that these foolish contraptions actually functioned. "You might be onto something," Henry admitted, "though I still think you're half crazy." After Henry departed, Lemuel spent the rest of the day modifying his deadfall traps according to their discussion. He added the bright cloth markers using strips torn from an old red flannel shirt he'd been saving for patching material. He adjusted the trigger tensions, making them less sensitive. And he repositioned 2 of the traps away from areas where elk might naturally pass. The encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. In his determination to solve the wolf problem, he'd created a danger to other humans. That wasn't acceptable. Any defense system needed to protect its user without becoming a hazard to everyone else. It was a lesson he'd remember years later when guiding wagon trains. Settlers, especially those with children, needed camp defenses that wouldn't injure curious kids or distracted adults. The modifications Henry had suggested became standard components of Lemuel's later teaching. Always mark your deterrence clearly. Always adjust for the weight and behavior of what you're trying to deter. Always consider unintended consequences. The 12th night brought the real test of Lemuel's systems. A cold front had moved through that evening, dropping temperatures well below what they'd been. His dogs were restless, whining occasionally, their ears constantly swiveling toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Lemuel knew what that meant. The wolves were back, and they were hungry. Around 9 o'clock, his cup and tin alarm system began clanging. Not the single sharp ring of one cup being bumped, but multiple cups clanging repeatedly. Multiple wolves moving along multiple approach trails simultaneously. This was coordinated behavior. The pack had split up to probe his defenses from different directions. Lemuel grabbed his rifle and positioned himself where he could see all 3 main approach directions. His dogs were barking frantically now, spinning between threats, unsure which direction to defend. Through the darkness, Lemuel could make out shapes moving beyond his alarm perimeters, dark forms that would appear briefly in the faint moonlight, then vanish again. He heard one of his deadfall traps trigger with a crash. The wolves in that direction scattered, but only briefly. Within minutes, they were back, testing the perimeter from a slightly different angle. The smoke from his secondary fire was working mostly. The wind was cooperating, pushing thick smoke toward the eastern approach. The wolves from that direction kept their distance, occasionally coughing in the acrid haze. But the northern and western approaches were less protected. The wind wasn't covering those angles as effectively. Lemuel made a quick decision. He couldn't defend all directions at once. He needed to concentrate his defenses. Working quickly, he dragged burning logs from his main fire to create 2 smaller fire rings on the northern and western sides of his camp. It wasn't enough heat to keep him warm, but it was enough light to push the wolves back 20 feet on those sides. Combined with his smoke fire covering the eastern approach and his dogs positioned to guard the southern direction where the terrain was most open, he'd created a rough defensive perimeter. The wolves tested it for hours. They'd approach to the edge of the light, pause, circle, try a different angle. Lemuel heard his remaining deadfall traps trigger twice more crash, scramble, retreat. But each time the wolves would regroup and try again. They were determined tonight. The cold weather meant they needed food urgently. His camp represented warmth, potential food scraps, vulnerable dogs. Around midnight, one wolf larger than the others, probably the pack leader, made a bold move. It circled wide around Lemuel's eastern smoke fire, enduring the acrid haze, and came in from an angle that put it partially behind one of his fire rings. The wolf was inside his defensive perimeter, maybe 25 feet from where Lemuel sat. His dogs went berserk, charging toward the intruder. Lemuel grabbed his rifle, brought it up, took aim, and hesitated. The wolf wasn't attacking. It was standing there, watching, evaluating. If Lemuel fired, he'd blow his entire powder reserve for the next week. He'd also teach the wolves that rifles meant death, which might actually make them more cautious. But it would also reveal that he only had one shot before needing to reload, and reloading a muzzle loader took precious seconds, during which he'd be vulnerable. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like minutes. Man and wolf stared at each other across the firelight. Lemuel's finger tightened on the trigger. The wolf's muscles tensed, ready to spring in any direction. Then one of his dogs, the black and gray mixed breed with uncertain ancestry, did something unexpected. Instead of barking and snarling, it lowered its head, tucked its tail, and approached the wolf with submissive body language. Not surrendering, but acknowledging, communicating in the language of canines. The wolf's posture shifted slightly. Its ears came forward instead of laid back. The 2 animals stood there, maybe 8 feet apart, having some kind of exchange that Lemuel couldn't understand, but could clearly observe. After a long moment, the wolf turned and trotted back out of the camp perimeter, passing through the smoke without hesitation this time. The pack didn't leave immediately. Lemuel heard them circling for another hour, occasionally testing his alarms, but with noticeably less aggression than before. Whatever communication had passed between his dog and that wolf had changed something. By 2 in the morning, the howling had moved further away, up into the higher ridges. The wolves had given up for the night. Lemuel sat there until dawn, keeping his fires burning, his rifle across his lap. He was exhausted, but he was alive. His camp was intact. His dogs were unharmed. And he'd learned something crucial. Even well-designed defensive systems had vulnerabilities. Wolves were smart enough to find them. But Lemuel still wasn't finished. He'd created alarms and physical deterrents, but he recognized the most effective defense would work continuously, not just when wolves triggered traps or alarms. The idea came from observing how wolves reacted to smoke. Fire had always been the mountain man's primary defense. Light kept animals at bay. Heat provided comfort. Smoke marked human presence. But Lemuel noticed wolves reacted differently to different types of smoke. Dry pine or cottonwood? Wolves seemed relatively unbothered. But when he'd accidentally added green wood or damp material, creating thick, acrid smoke, the wolves moved further away and seemed more agitated. It wasn't the smoke itself. It was the particular quality. Thick, choking smoke affected their sensitive noses, interfered with their ability to track by scent, made the area uncomfortable. Mountain men in the 1830s knew about smoke preservation of meat. They knew certain materials produced more smoke than others. Green wood, damp leaves, particularly buffalo dung, which mountain men called buffalo chips. Lemuel began experimenting with fire management. Instead of one large fire with dry wood, he created two smaller fire rings. His main fire provided heat and light, burning with clean wood. His secondary fire, positioned upwind between his position and the most common wolf approach direction, burned with materials specifically chosen to produce maximum smoke. He'd layer buffalo chips with damp leaves, green pine branches, occasionally organ materials from hunting kills. The result was thick, pungent smoke that rolled across his camp perimeter in dense clouds whenever wind cooperated. The smoke served multiple purposes. It obscured visual approach, making wolves uncertain about his exact position. It overwhelmed scent markers, making tracking by smell nearly impossible. And it created physical discomfort. Wolves breathing that thick smoke would find their eyes watering and noses overwhelmed. Most importantly, it changed the risk-reward calculation. Even if they could push through the smoke, time spent in that uncomfortable zone made them vulnerable. A wolf breathing smoke couldn't smell approaching predators or track prey effectively. The smoke strategy wasn't perfect. It required fairly consistent wind direction. When wind died completely or shifted unpredictably, smoke would settle around his own camp, making conditions unpleasant for him too. He learned to position his sleeping robes in locations with good air circulation, even when smoke was thick. He also learned to read weather. Before wind patterns became too unpredictable, usually around midnight, when thermal currents changed, he'd let his smoke fire die down and rely on his other systems. On the 14th night, Lemuel sat by his fires, one burning clean, one billowing thick smoke, and realized he hadn't heard his alarm system trigger in over 2 hours. His dogs, instead of maintaining constant vigilance, had relaxed enough to sleep in shifts. The wolves were still out there. He could occasionally hear them howling in the distance, but they weren't approaching anymore. The final component came from a conversation months earlier with a Shoshone guide named Standing Bear. Standing Bear had explained that his people didn't view wolves as enemies to be destroyed. They were respected as fellow predators, competitors for resources, but not fundamentally different from humans in their need to hunt and survive. The wolf, Standing Bear had said, he don't want fight, he want eat. You make it easy to eat here, he come here. You make it hard to eat here, he go somewhere else. Simple. This philosophy influenced Lemuel's final innovation, active territory management. Each morning, after checking trap lines, Lemuel would deliberately walk the perimeter of his camp area, not just the immediate space around his fire, but the broader territory he was effectively claiming. He'd mark trees by cutting small blazes with his hatchet. He'd deliberately leave signs of human activity, strips of cloth tied to branches, piles of stones arranged in unnatural patterns, areas where he'd cleared brush or moved deadfall. These markers served a psychological purpose. Animals generally respect established territories, especially when the occupant is actively maintaining them. A static camp suggests weakness or temporary occupation. A camp where the human is constantly present, constantly modifying the environment, constantly reinforcing boundaries, suggests permanent occupation and active defense. Lemuel also began leaving his worn clothing items, a torn shirt, and old moccasin at strategic points around his perimeter. These items carried his scent, and by distributing them around his territory, he created the olfactory impression of multiple humans occupying the area. The wolves investigating these scent markers would encounter human smell at multiple points. The conclusion from a wolf's perspective would be that this area was occupied by several humans, not just one, and several humans represented a much more formidable threat. He also began varying his daily routine deliberately. Instead of checking trap lines at the same time each morning, he'd vary his departure time. Instead of always approaching camp from the same direction, he'd circle around and enter from different angles. This unpredictability made it difficult for wolves to establish a pattern. They couldn't reliably predict when the camp would be unoccupied or when Lemuel would be vulnerable. This might seem paranoid. Some of his fellow trappers would later suggest exactly that, but it was based on sound observation. Wolves are opportunistic hunters. They watch, they learn patterns, they exploit predictability. A lone elk that always drinks from the same spot at the same time becomes an easy target. A lone elk that varies its behavior remains unpredictable and therefore more difficult to hunt. By applying this same principle to his own behavior, Lemuel made himself a more difficult target. By the 16th night at his tributary camp, Lemuel's comprehensive defensive system had achieved something remarkable. The wolves had stopped trying. He still heard them howling in surrounding hills. He occasionally saw their tracks crossing nearby areas. But they weren't approaching his immediate camp anymore. They'd learned that this particular area offered more challenges than rewards. The cost of implementing these systems had been significant. Time spent that could have been used trapping. Resources consumed rope, animal materials, extra firewood that had other potential uses. Risk of injury while setting deadfall traps and managing smoke fires. But Lemuel's calculations proved correct. Over those 2.5 weeks, he harvested 43 beaver pelts. At $4 to $6 each, that represented between $170 and $260 in value. After the Rocky Mountain Fur Company took its cut, typically 40% for company trappers, Lemuel would clear his entire remaining debt and have surplus for the first time since entering the mountains. More importantly, he'd solved a problem that would become increasingly common as more trappers pushed into high country and wolf populations adapted to human presence. When Lemuel finally packed up his camp in late November and rode south to rejoin his brigade, he expected approval for his harvest, but didn't expect interest in his methods. He was wrong on both counts. His harvest drew nods, but little enthusiasm. 43 beaver was good, but not exceptional. But when Lemuel casually mentioned how he dealt with the wolves, he drew immediate and intense interest. Wolf problems were becoming universal. As trapping pressure increased and prime beaver streams became depleted, trappers were pushing into more remote areas with larger wolf populations. Stories circulated at every rendezvous about close calls, about camps being invaded, about dogs being killed. Around the evening campfire, Lemuel described his cup and tin alarm system. Some trappers nodded thoughtfully. Others dismissed it. One veteran named Horace Finch actually laughed. "String up tin cups?" Finch said, spitting tobacco juice into the fire. "That's the foolishest thing I ever heard. Wolves will figure that out in 2 nights and walk right past it." Lemuel didn't argue. He simply described his scent markers, smoke management, deadfall traps, and territory maintenance routine. The laughter gradually stopped. Veterans began asking detailed questions about rope configurations, trigger mechanisms, smoke-producing materials. By evening's end, 3 trappers had committed to trying variations of Lemuel's methods. 2 were skeptical, but admitted the logic made sense. Only old Finch remained dismissive. 3 months later, Finch was found dead in his camp, his throat torn open, his supplies scattered. The tracks around his camp told the story. A pack of at least 6 wolves had come in the night. His fire had died. His dogs had fled. He'd reached for his rifle, but never got a shot off. The other trappers didn't say much about it, but after that, nobody called Lemuel's inventions foolish anymore. Over the following years, variations of Lemuel Rusk's wolf deterrent systems spread through the mountain man community through storytelling and practical demonstration. At rendezvous gatherings, trappers described modifications. A trapper named Micah Woodworth developed what he called wolf flags, strips of cloth torn from red flannel shirts and tied to rope strung around camp. The movement of cloth in the wind created constant motion that made wolves nervous. This was similar to what would later be called phledry, formally studied by wildlife biologists more than a century later. Another trapper, Jacob Henley, expanded on Lemuel's scent marker concept by deliberately processing animal kills near his camp perimeter. The blood and organs he couldn't use, he'd spread in a semicircle around camp. The deadfall trap design was modified by Isaiah Cortland, who added small bells to the trigger mechanism. When a wolf hit the trip line, the branch would fall, and bells would create additional noise that spooked wolves even more effectively. Not all innovations succeeded. Benjamin Cross tried to improve on smoke fires by adding gunpowder to create explosive bursts of noise and light. He succeeded in wasting expensive gunpowder, starting a small wildfire, and frightening his horses into stampeding. What's significant is that this knowledge spread entirely through oral tradition. These were not educated men. Many could barely read or write. They didn't publish papers or create diagrams. They simply shared information around campfires, refined it through practical application, and passed it along to younger trappers. Lemuel himself continued trapping until 1838, when the beaver population collapsed and the fur market died. European fashion had shifted from beaver hats to silk, and the trade that had drawn thousands into the Rockies was finished. Like many mountain men, Lemuel transitioned into guiding work. Settlers were beginning to move west in larger numbers, following trails that trappers had pioneered. These families faced different challenges. They traveled with wagons, with livestock that attracted predators. But the basic principles of camp defense remained relevant. Wagon-trained families were particularly interested in his wolf deterrent methods. The cup and tin alarm systems were easy to set up. The smoke management techniques could be scaled for larger camps. By the mid-1840s, Lemuel was earning a respectable living as a guide. He'd married a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow in 1840, and they settled near Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming, operating a small trading post for Oregon Trail travelers. When Lemuel Rusk died in 1867 at Fort Bridger at age 60, the mountain man era had been over for more than a quarter century. The beaver trade had collapsed. The frontier was being transformed by railroads, telegraph lines, farming communities. But the knowledge he'd developed continued to influence how people approached wilderness survival. The techniques weren't perfect. Modern wildlife management would eventually develop more sophisticated methods. Motion-activated lights and sound systems would replace campfire smoke and tin cup alarms. But the fundamental principles remained valid. Create uncertainty, establish clear boundaries, make approach costly in terms of time and comfort. Maintain unpredictable patterns. These principles work because they're based on understanding wolf behavior rather than simply trying to overpower wolves through force. That cold November morning in 1833, when Lemuel dropped his steel trap in the Wind River Creek and looked nervously at the tree line, he couldn't have known he was about to develop techniques that would influence frontier survival for generations. He was just a man with a problem that needed solving, with limited resources and determination to stay where beaver were plentiful. Sometimes that's all innovation requires: a problem, limited resources, and someone stubborn enough to keep trying new approaches until something works. The wolves are still out there in the Wind River country. The beaver have largely recovered from the overhunting of the mountain man era. And the techniques Lemuel Rusk developed on those cold November nights, refined and modernized, but based on the same fundamental principles, continue to help people coexist with wolves across North America.